I flew to Phoenix this past week via Chicago. And when I boarded the plane to go to Chicago and was walking through first class to join the other have-nots at the back of the plane, I recognized Doug Ford, the brother of the former Toronto mayor, sitting in first class, and for whatever reason, I fist bumped him as if I knew him, and I don't know him. And he said to me, "Hey, nice to see you," as if he knew me, and he doesn't know me. Very friendly guy. I had a direct flight back to Toronto from Phoenix, and I sat beside a guy who was somewhat embarrassed to admit that he was a TTC driver, Toronto Transit Commission bus driver. Very fascinating character, baptized Eastern Orthodox, the cousin of Peter Zezel. How many people here remember Peter Zezel? He played for the Philadelphia Flyers and the Toronto Maple Leafs. Thoroughly blue collar. I wonder if you can guess this morning what he thought of Rob Ford. Well, he loved Rob Ford, thought he was the greatest mayor that Toronto ever had. And Rob Ford is someone who was and is extremely popular with blue-collar folk. When you think of those who are running for the president south of the border, which presidential contender do you think is most like Rob Ford? It has to be Donald Trump. It has to be Donald Trump. I don't know if it's just me. Maybe it's you, but I love, for all the wrong reasons, I love seeing Donald Trump and hearing Donald Trump. Don't mistake me, I think he would be a terrible president, the worst president ever. I don't agree with a lot of what he says, but there's something refreshing about him because he doesn't kowtow to the media thought police, right? He just says whatever's on his mind, and that's the problem, of course. He shouldn't speak his mind. But all of this makes it a very interesting time for those of us living in North America, especially for those living in the U.S. Who will be the next president? There's so much suspense, so much anticipation. Imagine with me this morning what it was like to live in Israel at this time. When Samuel had just told them in the previous chapter that the Lord was going to give them a king, their very first king, what would that be like? And who would he be? At the end of the last chapter, Samuel dismissed the people, and they had to wait to find out who God would choose to be their first king. That's where we are in the story. The story is full of suspense, full of anticipation. And what we discover in our text is that God is going to choose an impressive man. He's going to choose an impressive man in a playful manner. And we're going to note, if you're taking notes this morning, we're going to see, first of all, the playful manner, and then secondly, the impressive man. God chooses an impressive man in a playful manner. God is going to appoint Israel's very first king, and we expect a dignified and elegant story. And what we get is a very earthy story about a farmer's son who goes on this expedition to find his father's lost donkeys. We expect an elegant account, an impressive narrative. We get something rather earthy, something mundane, even somewhat tedious. We're told that the initial search expedition failed. The narrator says they went through the town of Ephraim, couldn't find the donkeys, went through Shalisha, went through Sha'alim, went through Benjamin, did not find them. And we're reading through the story and we say, thank you, narrator, for giving us that information. That's helpful. That's going to help me in my life today. And then we get this long-winded conversation between Saul and his servant. What should they do? Where should they go? There's a seer. If we go and see him, what kind of gift should we bring him? Oh, I've got a quarter of a shekel of silver. Even the narrator himself seems to think it's long-winded because in verse 8 he says, and the servant answered Saul again. Thank you, narrator, for giving us all that information. That's helpful. The story of Israel's very first king is an earthy and mundane story about donkeys that were lost. But I suspect there's more meaning in it than first meets the eye. I wonder how many here this morning are familiar with the word providence. Some of you will be, some of you perhaps not. Providence is the word that describes this idea that God oversees all the affairs of our lives. He controls, in fact, all the events of our lives, even those events that are seemingly insignificant and inconsequential. And this story is full of seemingly insignificant and inconsequential factoids. Just so happens that the donkeys are lost. Just so happens that Saul and his servant go the wrong way. Just so happens they go to the town where Samuel lives. Just so happens that they decide this is where they're going to rest. Just so happens that the servant knows that there's a prophet there. Just so happens that it's the day when Samuel has come home. Just so happens that when they enter the city, they find Samuel. Etc., etc., etc. A proverb comes to mind, chapter 16, verse 9. The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Now that is something that is on the one hand very unnerving, because we find ourselves doing things and going places and we don't really know the significance of it. And sometimes we pose the question, Lord, what on earth are you doing in my life? What on earth is the meaning of this trip, of this expedition, of this day in my life? It's unnerving, but I want you to see with me this morning that it can also be very exciting. Because through the things that seem inconsequential and mundane and earthy and insignificant in our lives, God is sometimes doing very important things, marvelous things. Brings to mind another proverb, which says it's the glory of God to conceal things, and it's the glory of kings to search things out. It's the glory of God to conceal things, and it's the glory of kings to search things out. God and king are presented in the proverb as playful competitors in a game of hide and seek. God hides and the king must find. God does the hiding, the concealing, the covering, and the king does the looking and the searching and the seeking. And here in this passage, God does the concealing, and he's concealed two things. He's concealed the location of the donkeys, and he's concealed the identity of Israel's first king. God does the hiding, Saul does the searching. And in the end, we discover that what is found that has ultimate significance is not the location of the donkeys, but the identity of Israel's first king. So do you see with me this morning God's playful approach here? The story begins with Saul looking for donkeys. It ends with Israel finding a king. I was trying to tease out the meaning of this, and for a while I was playing with the thought that Saul is a donkey. He's the one that's found, right? That proved to be a fruitless line of speculation for me, though it works for a little bit. But isn't this an inviting way for us this morning to look at our lives, which we judge often are full of the trivial, full of the inconsequential, full of the insignificant, and God is teaching us here and elsewhere that there's nothing mechanical about our lives. There's nothing robotic about our lives. Our lives are dynamic and lively and engaging. I wonder how often you recognize that, how often you're open to that. Isn't it amazing how many scientific discoveries are unintended? The scientists are looking for one thing and they discover something else. The most famous story here is the story of Alexander Fleming, who, was researching in the influenza virus back in the 1920s, and he had a dish with some bacteria culture, and he left them on his desk, and he went away on a 2-week vacation, came back, and he discovered, he's kind of a messy fellow, that there was some mold growing around the sides of the dish, but then he discovered that where the mold was, the bacteria couldn't survive. It was the discovery of penicillin, one of the greatest medical discoveries of our time. And you're a mom in church this morning, you're saying, why is my son so sloppy, so messy? Well, maybe he's about to make the next great medical discovery. All the sloppy boys and girls are like, yes, vindicated. But your dog has run away from home and you're trying to find him. You say, what's the purpose of this? Wasting all this time looking for a lost dog. But maybe God is doing something that you don't know, that you can't see, that's going to be of great significance in your life and perhaps in the lives of others. So live patiently, live expectantly, and look for the surprises of God's grace. God chooses an impressive man in a playful manner. Well, we've seen the playful manner. What about the impressive man? Saul. I don't know about you, but I'm inclined to read the story of Saul negatively. I'm inclined to look at the person of Saul negatively. We have to be careful not to let the end of his life color how we read the beginning of his life. Because if we're familiar with the Bible story, then we know that at the end he turned against the Lord and fought against the Lord's anointed. But in the end, or in the beginning rather, the account is rather endearing. Saul is a stellar individual, an impressive man, and for this reason, God has selected him. What's so impressive about him? A number of things. He has an impressive pedigree, an impressive ancestry. He's a man of Kish from Benjamin, a man of wealth. Now, this is during the time of the Judges. What do you know about the tribe of Benjamin during the time of Judges? Well, they had gone apostate. And if there was one town in the apostate tribe of Benjamin that was a moral cesspool, it was Gibeah. And now we read about a man called Kish from this apostate tribe of Benjamin that God had judged, who comes, in fact, we learn from another portion of Scripture, from the moral cesspool of Gibeah. And out of this God-forsaken place, this place of apostasy and sin and God's judgment, there's a man named Kish who is wise, who does well, and has a wonderful family. Can anything good come out of Benjamin? Yes, something good can come out of Benjamin. This is one of the many ways, by the way, in which the story of Saul parallels the story of David. Bethlehem, the time of Judges, was also an apostate town. Read the end of Judges. It's the location of the unfaithful priest, Judges 17, the concubine, Judges 19. Let me check my notes, make sure I got this right. Yeah, Judges 19. In the book of Ruth, you have the judgment famine on Bethlehem. And yet out of the God-forsaken place of Bethlehem, this place of sin and apostasy and God's judgment, comes a man named Jesse, who's wise, who does well, who has a wonderful family. Can anything good come out of Bethlehem? Yes, certainly. Now, isn't that encouraging for us? We look in our context, secular Canada, where everything seems to be spiraling morally into some kind of demise. But we learn that in these dark places characterized by sin, God still works and does something wonderful. Even in outer darkness, there is light, the light of God's grace. Saul has impressive pedigree. He has an impressive appearance. He's described again and again as handsome. Now, again, we tend to read his handsomeness negatively. And we think of what Samuel says when David is selected, which is, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. We see his handsomeness as a strike against him. Yet his handsomeness is important. It's apparent in the text because he meets these women at the well who seem to be quite enamored with him. He asks them about the seer, and the text says they all answered. They all wanted the opportunity to speak to this handsome Jewish Justin Bieber. Bad example, you're saying. This handsome Jewish George Clooney. Some of you are like, a little better. Very handsome person. What's the significance of that? I find it interesting that in the Old Testament, God often selects handsome men to be leaders of his people. Moses is described as beautiful. Joseph is described as handsome in form and appearance. David is described as ruddy with beautiful eyes and handsome. You say, what's the significance of that? Well, you see, especially in the Old Testament, all of these leaders that God selects who are handsome are symbols of Adam. In the garden, the ideal man, the perfect man, and all of these individuals are called to be new Adams, people whose decisions affect the destiny of others. And Saul, we're going to see this in several ways, is like a new Adam. He's privileged, but he falls like the first Adam. He doesn't listen to the word of God. He isn't patient. He takes of the forbidden fruit. Now, I know what you're all thinking right now. You're all thinking, I don't know if our pastor's qualified to be a leader because he's bald and weathered. He's got glasses. that are actually bifocals, whose eyes are bad in all kinds of ways. Well, I want to remind you of what the New Testament teaches, because I do think this is an Old Testament motif, that God uses the weak things in the world to magnify his power. He uses the foolish to shame the wise. And so, in this way, I vindicate myself standing before you this morning. An impressive pedigree, an impressive appearance. Thirdly, lastly, impressive qualities. He's a caring man. When we first meet David, he's caring for his father's sheep. When we first meet Saul, he's looking for his father's donkeys. You have two men who care for animals, which in the Bible is an index of whether one cares for people. He's caring in other ways. At a certain point, when he and his servant are out looking for the donkeys, he says, wait a minute, maybe we should just stop and go home because my dad's probably worried sick about us. You see that in the story? He's not like the careless teenager who's out to 3 a.m. in the morning, not caring whether his parents or her parents are worried. He's a thoughtful person. He has his priorities in the right place. He cares for animals. He's concerned about his father. Saul is also humble. He receives advice even from an inferior. Did you notice that? The servant says, hey, maybe we should go find this seer and we can give him as a gift a quarter of a shekel. And Saul says, well said. Good idea. That's a mark of a good leader, willing to receive advice from an inferior. Furthermore, when Samuel informs Saul of his importance, then Saul says, who am I? I'm from the lowly tribe of Benjamin. I'm from the smallest clan in this lowly tribe. He's a humble person. Saul reminds him of that later on in 1 Samuel. He says, though you are little in your eyes, are you not head of all the tribes? So Saul for a long time began to see himself with modesty and humility. Well, there's a lot of anticipation in the air around Israel. Who's going to be her first king? It's interesting that the word king is not used in this chapter. We read about prince, we read about ruler. We know Saul is going to be the king. We have the reader's edge, but Israel doesn't know that yet, and Saul himself doesn't know that yet. But Israel is in for a treat, because they're going to get a leader who is handsome, caring, humble, and the Lord has chosen him to be the anointed one. Notice what the Lord says to Samuel, verse 16. You shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen my people because their cry has come to me. Now perhaps, and we'll conclude with this question, perhaps you're wondering, why is the portrait of Saul so favorable when the description, the portrait of a king in the previous chapter is so negative? Isn't that fascinating? We get this negative portrait of a king in chapter 8, and we get this wonderful, favorable portrait of Saul in chapter 9. It's an enigma that continues for several chapters, and Bible scholars draw attention to it, that the speeches of Samuel are always negative and the stories of Saul are always positive. You get it in chapter 11, for example, a favorable story about Saul, how he saves Jabesh Gilead, and then next chapter you get a negative speech from Samuel. Now, the higher critics talk about pro-monarchy texts and anti-monarchy texts. There are some texts that are pro-kingship and other texts that are anti-kingship, and these texts have different authors and different sources, and at some point in Israel's history, an editor came along and put them all together haphazardly. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. I think the Bible recognizes something that Lord Acton said, which is power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Or as a friend of mine says, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. The power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the prophet exists to keep the power of the king in check. And that's why from this point on, right into the exile, you have the prophets always critiquing the kings, warning the kings, reminding the kings of their true mission. Israel must have a king, that's true, but Israel's king must be godly. Someone the Lord has selected, someone the Lord has equipped, someone who will fulfill the Lord's mission for the king. The prophet in Israel had to ensure that kingship remained compatible with covenant. Now, what was the chief obligation of the Abrahamic covenant? The people of Israel were to be a blessing for all the nations. They were to be a kingdom of priests for the whole world. They were to be a light to the nations, and the king was supposed to enable the people to be that light, to be that conduit of blessings for the world, to be that kingdom of priests. But the problem again and again is that Israel failed. Israel failed. And so she had to be delivered again and again from her enemies, whom God sent to discipline her and chastise her. And God used kings in many cases to orchestrate that deliverance and to save them. Now, it's of tremendous relevance for us to recognize that sequence. We have a calling in the world. God chooses us to be His people in the world, not simply so we can come together and celebrate that fact. Hurrah, hurrah, we are God's people. We're God's elect nation. But God always chooses to use. He chooses people to use them. He chooses people out of the world and sends them right back into the world to be a salt and a light to continue His mission in the world. The problem is that we're broken and we're tainted and we're distorted and perverted and stained. But God is merciful in what He says of Saul. In verse 16, He says of Jesus, I have anointed Him Prince of my people. He shall save my people from their enemies, for their cry has come up to me. And you remember how the angel said to Joseph, you shall call Him Jesus, for He will save His people from their sins. So this morning we rejoice in the King God has given us. We celebrate this King who equips us for the mission God has given us. Thank Jesus today. Celebrate Jesus' deliverance of you. But don't stop there. Serve Jesus, the faithful King par excellence, who fully enables His people to be God's conduit of blessing in the world, to be a light for the nations. Let's pray together.